The halls of Greenfield High buzzed with excitement. The school was hosting a special alumni event, and the legendary Jason Statham had returned, once a struggling student, now an internationally famous action star. As Jason walked through the corridors, memories hit him hard. The countless late-night training sessions, doubts about his future, the endless pressure. And through it all, one man had always been there. Then, he saw him. An elderly man, hunched slightly, pushing a mop bucket across the tiled floor. His uniform, faded and slightly oversized, still carried the same name tag, Mr. Carter. Jason's chest tightened. Mr. Carter. The same janitor who had lifted him up when no one else did. The man who told him to never quit, to keep pushing, to fight for his future. Yet here he was. At 80 years old. Still working. Jason felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just nostalgia. This was wrong. He clenched his fists. Why was Mr. Carter still here? Fire Jason was about to find out, and what he would do next would leave everyone speechless. Before continue, like and subscribe to catch Jason Statham's epic move with school's janitor, and comment where you're watching from today. Jason walked through the halls of Greenfield High, his footsteps echoing off the polished floors. The memories hit him like a freight train. This was where he struggled to find his place. Where teachers told him to focus on grades, but his mind was always on the next fight, the next training session. Late nights, drenched in sweat, pushing himself past exhaustion in the school gym. Wondering if he'd ever make it. And through it all, one person had always been there. Mr. Carter. The janitor who never judged. Who handed him a water bottle after a brutal practice. Who told him, "You're gonna do something great one day, kid. Just don't stop fighting." Jason hadn't forgotten those words. Back then, he was just another troubled student, another kid teachers gave up on. But Mr. Carter? He had believed in him. Jason exhaled sharply, shaking the thoughts away. That was decades ago. Back when Mr. Carter was strong, energetic, the man who kept the school running. But now, Jason watched closely. The old man moved slowly, gripping the mop handle for support. His frail hands trembled as he lifted a heavy bucket, struggling not to spill the water. His once powerful frame had thinned with age. His back was hunched, his movements stiff. Yet, he kept going. Jason frowned. Why was he still here? A group of teenagers walked past, laughing, barely noticing Mr. Carter. One of them bumped into his cleaning cart, barely muttering an apology before continuing down the hall. Mr. Carter sighed. He bent down with effort, wiping away footprints left on the wet floor. His knees shook slightly as he steadied himself. Jason's jaw tightened. This wasn't right. This man had dedicated his life to this school, to these students. And yet, no one seemed to care. Jason's chest tightened as he remembered his younger self, exhausted after training, collapsing onto the gym floor. Mr. Carter had found him there once, barely able to move, and instead of scolding him like a teacher might have, he had just handed him a water bottle and said, "One more round, kid. That's how you get stronger." Now, that same man, his quiet hero, was struggling to stand. Jason ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. He needed to know the truth. He took a deep breath, stepped forward, and spoke the name he hadn't said in years. Mr. Carter. The moment of truth was coming, and Jason was about to learn a reality that would change everything. Jason took a slow step forward, his voice steady yet carrying something deeper. Mr. Carter. The elderly janitor paused, mid-motion, gripping the mop handle. His body tensed slightly, as if the name had stirred something deep in his memory. Slowly, he turned. His tired eyes scanned Jason for a moment. Then, a flicker of recognition. His lips curled into a slow, knowing grin. Well, I'll be damned. Jason felt a warmth spread through his chest, despite the situation. Took me a second, but I'd recognize that troublemaker stance anywhere, Mr. Carter chuckled. Jason Statham. Hollywood's toughest guy, back in Greenfield High. Never thought I'd see the day. Jason smirked slightly, but his eyes held something unreadable. Didn't think I'd see you here either. Mr. Carter wiped his hands on his uniform and leaned slightly on the mop handle. What brings you back? Looking for detention. Jason huffed out a small laugh. Nah, think I served my time already. The humor faded as Jason took in the man before him. The deep wrinkles etched into his skin, the tired slump of his shoulders. The man who once walked these halls with an effortless presence now looked fragile. Jason's gaze flicked to the mop bucket, then back to Mr. Carter. Why are you still working, Mr. Carter? A flicker of something unreadable passed across the old man's face. He waved a hand dismissively. Ah, you know me, son. Gotta keep busy. Work keeps me going. Jason didn't buy it. He narrowed his eyes. That the real reason? Mr. Carter hesitated, then sighed. His voice softened, but his pride remained intact. Look, kid, retirement ain't for everyone. Pension's small. Bills gotta be paid. And sitting at home all day? That ain't my style. Jason's chest tightened. This man gave everything to this school. And now, at 80 years old, he was still here, not because he wanted to be, but because he had no choice. Jason's fists clenched at his sides. His jaw tightened. He could feel something rising inside him, a mix of anger and deep, personal guilt. This man had been there for him, pushed him forward when the world doubted him. And now, Mr. Carter was the one being left behind. Jason exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. You ever thought about retiring? The old janitor let out a chuckle. Sure. Thought about it 100 times. But thinking and doing ain't the same, kid. Takes money to retire. Ain't exactly rolling in cash like you. Jason's expression darkened. That's not right. Mr. Carter waved him off. Life ain't fair, Jason. Ain't no use getting upset over it. But Jason was upset. His entire life had been built on pushing forward, never backing down from a fight. And right now, he was looking at a fight that needed to be won. A beat of silence. Jason ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. He looked at Mr. Carter, then at the mop, then back again. For the first time in years, Jason felt truly powerless. His fingers curled slightly. Not in rage, but in silent determination. He had to fix this. But he didn't say it. Not yet. Instead, he took a step back, nodding slightly. All right, Mr. Carter. I hear you. The old man smiled. Good. Now, if you'll excuse me, these floors ain't gonna clean themselves. Jason watched as he turned back to his mop, slowly resuming his work. But something had changed. Fire Jason wasn't just going to let this go. He wasn't just going to walk away. He had already made up his mind. The next morning, Mr. Carter was just starting his shift when the school secretary approached him, looking hesitant. Mr. Carter, the principal needs to see you in his office. The old janitor frowned. Me? What for? The secretary shrugged. Not sure, but he said it's important. With a sigh, Mr. Carter put down his mop, wiped his hands on his uniform, and started walking. A strange feeling settled in his chest. Had something happened? Was he finally being forced into retirement? Slowly, he pushed open the office door, and froze. Sitting across from the principal, leaning back in a chair like he owned the place, was Jason Statham. Mr. Carter blinked. All right, what in the world is this about? Jason stood, his expression calm, but serious. Sit down, Mr. Carter. Confused, the janitor did as he was told. The principal folded his hands together. Mr. Carter, Jason came to us with a rather unexpected proposal. Jason leaned forward. His voice was quiet, but firm. You've done enough. It's time for you to rest. Mr. Carter scoffed. Rest? Kid, I've been working since before you could walk. What else am I supposed to do? Jason's stare didn't waver. Live, Mr. Carter. Without worrying about bills. Without breaking your back every day. Just live. The old janitor let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. Look, I appreciate the sentiment, but I don't take charity. Jason's jaw clenched. This ain't charity. This is me paying back a debt. Mr. Carter frowned. Debt. Jason nodded. You believed in me when no one else did. You told me to keep fighting. I never forgot that. You helped me when I had nothing. Now, I'm just returning the favor. The principal, who had been silent, finally cleared his throat. Mr. Carter, Jason has arranged something extraordinary for you. Jason reached into his pocket, pulled out a single envelope, and slid it across the desk. Mr. Carter hesitated before picking it up. His hands shook slightly as he opened it. His eyes widened as he read. Jason had set up a full retirement fund in his name. Heavy check mark every single debt. Paid off. Heavy check mark a full pension. Secured. Heavy check mark his medical care. Covered for life. Heavy check mark and a brand new home. Fully furnished. Mr. Carter's breath caught in his throat. His fingers trembled as he looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. Jason, what is this? Jason held his gaze. It's your time now, old man. You spent your life helping others. Now, it's time for someone to do the same for you. Silence. Mr. Carter's lip quivered. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He blinked rapidly, swallowing hard. The principal rubbed his forehead, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the moment. A second passed. Then another. Then Mr. Carter let out a shaky breath and chuckled softly. His voice, thick with emotion, barely escaped. Kid, you really did turn out all right. Fire Jason had given him his life back. And for the first time in decades, Mr. Carter could finally rest. The room was silent. Mr. Carter's fingers trembled as he held the paper in his hands. His breath was uneven, his chest rising and falling in short, shaky bursts. His vision blurred. Jason watched him carefully, but he already knew what was coming. Mr. Carter lowered his head, rubbing a hand over his face as he fought to steady himself. Finally, he exhaled a shaky breath. Kid, I can't accept this. Jason's jaw clenched. He leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. Yes, you can. And you will. Mr. Carter shook his head, his pride battling his emotions. I ain't never asked for a handout in my life. Jason's eyes softened, but his tone didn't waver. This ain't a handout. You gave me something when I had nothing, Mr. Carter. Let me do this for you. The old janitor let out a shaky chuckle, his lip trembling. Damn kid, you're as stubborn as you were back then. Jason smirked. Some things don't change. Mr. Carter looked down at the papers again. His hands, rough and aged from years of work, trembled slightly as he ran his fingers over the words. His voice dropped to a whisper. You really did this for me? Jason's response was simple. You did it for me first. Mr. Carter inhaled sharply, his body still, his chest tightening. He swallowed hard, but his lip quivered. His eyes, glassy with tears, flicked back to Jason. Jason didn't push him. He let the silence hang. Then, Mr. Carter nodded. A deep, slow nod. One that held a lifetime of gratitude. Jason gave him a small, knowing smile. A noise outside the office caught their attention. The door was slightly open. A few students had gathered in the hallway. Whispers filled the air. Wait, he helped Jason Statham? The janitor? That old guy. Are you serious? A teacher stepped forward, phone in hand, recording the moment. Jason ignored the attention. His focus was only on the man in front of him. Mr. Carter blinked rapidly, his shoulders shaking slightly. Finally, he let out a deep sigh, shaking his head. I always knew you'd make something of yourself, kid, but I never thought you'd come back. Jason felt his throat tighten. His voice was quieter this time. I never forgot where I came from. Then, something unexpected happened. The students, The same ones who had walked past Mr. Carter every day without a second glance, started clapping. It wasn't forced. It wasn't fake. It was real. At first, it was just one or two. Then, the others joined in. Mr. Carter turned toward the doorway, eyes wide as he saw the students watching him with something new. Respect. A slow smile spread across Jason's face. Told you, old man. You mattered more than you think. Fire that moment. It changed everything. By the end of the day, the video had gone viral. The world was watching. And Jason Statham had just reminded millions of people what true strength looked like. The next morning, the halls of Greenfield High felt different. For the first time in decades, Mr. Carter wouldn't be pushing a mop bucket down these halls. Instead, he was walking toward the exit, with Jason Statham by his side. As they reached the front doors, the entire school was waiting. Students, teachers, staff, they all stood together, lining the entrance, clapping as Mr. Carter took his final steps as a janitor. Some students held up signs. Heavy check mark. Thank you, Mr. Carter. Heavy check mark. You made a difference. Heavy check mark. We won't forget you. Mr. Carter stopped in his tracks. His hands trembled slightly. His eyes darted over the sea of faces, faces that, for years, had passed him by without a second glance. And now, they were here for him. He exhaled sharply, his throat tightening. Jason stepped forward, pulling out a small set of keys. Without a word, he placed them into Mr. Carter's palm. The old man stared at them, confused. Jason? Jason smirked. You didn't think I'd let you retire without a proper place to do it, did you? A lump formed in Mr. Carter's throat as he stared down at the keys. A home. A real home. His forever place. He clenched his jaw, trying to hold it together. His breath was shaky as he finally looked up. Jason extended a hand. You took care of me when I had nothing. Now it's my turn. Mr. Carter gripped Jason's hand firmly. Thank you, son. Jason gave him a small, knowing nod. Enjoy it, old man. No more long shifts. No more late nights. Just peace. That evening, Mr. Carter sat on the couch of his brand-new home. The air was still, peaceful. For the first time in years, he wasn't tired. He wasn't working. He was just home. Jason sat across from him, watching the old man take in every detail. The warm lighting, the framed photos, the space that finally belonged to him. Mr. Carter let out a breath. Feels strange, not having anything to do. Jason chuckled. You'll get used to it. The old janitor smirked slightly, shaking his head. I still think you were the biggest pain in my ass back in high school. Jason laughed. Yeah, but now I'm your favorite pain in the ass. Mr. Carter chuckled, his voice warm. His gaze drifted around the room one last time. For the first time in decades, he could rest. Fire Jason Statham had just made sure he'd never have to struggle again. The world knew Jason Statham as an action hero. A man who fought battles on screen, took down villains, and never backed down from a challenge. But this was his real fight. Because true strength isn't about fame, money, or power. It's about giving back. Mr. Carter was never just a janitor. He was a mentor, a guide, a quiet hero. He didn't demand attention. He didn't expect recognition. But his words, his kindness, and his belief in others changed lives. And now, the world finally saw him for what he truly was. News outlets picked up the story. Social media exploded with praise. Millions of people, students, workers, strangers, saw the impact of one man's kindness. Jason stood beside Mr. Carter, not as a movie star, but as a man repaying a debt that could never truly be repaid. As cameras captured the moment, Jason said only one thing. Fire, the real ones never forget where they came from. And with that, he walked away, proving that in the end, the greatest fights aren't won with fists. They're won with heart. Because true strength isn't about what you take. It's about what you give.